Hi there, my name is Steve Gladys, and today we're going to be talking about people and teams, specifically how to coach them, how to get the most out of people in teams. Um, I think you'll find this interesting and useful in your day-to-day activity. So let's begin by doing a little exercise wherever you are. Just take out a piece of paper and um, think about the best leader you ever had. Could be somebody way back when you were working at McDonald's, or a football coach, or a basketball coach, or a soccer coach. It could be anybody. It could be somebody you're working with right now. Think about that person and think about and write down on a piece of paper 2 or 3 things about how that leader made you feel. How did that leader make you feel? And if you want, put a pause on this right now while you're doing that. Now, let's say we're back in class, and what typically we see at this point is people you write words like, I felt valued, I felt like I was heard, I felt like my voice mattered, I felt confident, I felt strong, I felt like I was part of our team, I felt really good. Most people write down words that are generally positive in nature. I've never seen anybody write something negative. It's always been very positive. So typically, great leadership, best leaders, make you feel really positive and ready to do the work. And that failure, even if it's an option, doesn't really matter. It matters that you learn from the failure. That's the kind of great leaders that we see. Gallup did the same study, by the way, with about 10,000 people, and they found that 4 things happened, or they found 4 buckets, I should say, that all these words, these thousands of words that they got back from their readers, they all four fell into 4 different buckets. First of all was trust. In trust, we talk about a trust triangle. Character, are you honest? Do you do what you say you're going to do? Competent, do you know what you're doing, or you know how to lead a team? And caring, do you really care about me? And if you have all 3 of these together, the trust between you and the other person and vice versa holds up. If one of them's missing, it collapses. We call it the trust triangle. The second one is compassion, and that is this idea of do I care enough in a situation to help you? Sympathy is just thinking about somebody's problem, maybe writing them a sympathy note. Empathy is both sympathy and empathy, and basically it's head and heart. That's, I know your brother died. I've had that happen to me. I'm so sorry. And compassion is head, heart, and hands, which is I'm sorry, I heard that your brother died. I've had that happen, and we're bringing over dinner tonight. So compassion is much more about actually doing something, which is actually stronger for people. That's a second bucket that Gallup found. The third one was hope, that things that pointed toward the future, excuse me, things that pointed toward the future and were generally positive and optimistic looking forward, were in this category. The opposite, of course, is fear, and that locks you in the current state. And the third one, or the fourth one rather, was stability. People like teams and working for leaders that were stable. In my own instance, I worked for 2 guys at the FBI. One was Phil and one was Bill. Phil was the kind of guy that always was with you, always had your back, and always sort of took care of you. And Bill, after Phil left, Bill came in, and he was just the absolute opposite. And so what started to happen was, because nobody trusted Bill, and certainly as much as they trusted Phil, they started to leave. And who left first? Was it the ones with the least amount of options or the most amount of options? The answer is people with the most go first, which is kind of a double whammy, because the people that stay behind are oftentimes the people who you kind of secretly wish might leave, but don't. When you think about it, there are a number of leadership styles, and I think if I asked you to in your classroom to list them, you would list things like micromanager, laissez-faire, and so forth and so on. There's a lot of leadership styles out there. 3 that we come in contact with a lot is, number 1 is command and control. And where do you see this typically? You see it in first responders, police officers, fire, ambulance folks, the first tech people, the ambulance tech people, the 911 responders. In the military, what's interesting about command and control is it's been around forever, but it has always been regarded as the leadership methodology of last resort. When you have to resort to this, it's the last card that you play. Do it because I said so. Do it because I outrank you. And typically, it's only used, even in police departments, about 10% of the time, when there is emergencies afoot, and you really need to move fast. When you use it on a regular basis, command and control on a regular basis, you begin to lose leadership control. The second is fixers. A lot of folks who are very kind-hearted fall into this trap. They want to do everything for everybody, and so as a result, they kind of work themselves to death. The methodology we recommend is coaching, this coach approach, where you ask questions to help people kind of form a mental rough draft of what they're thinking. You know what? Until you put something on a piece of paper, you can't edit it, and until you say it, you can't understand it if it's rattling around in your head. And that's why this is so important. And the technique we use for that is coaching. Coaching is a conversation with a purpose. It's a very directed conversation. It's not a 50-50 conversation either. It's not I talk, you talk, which is kind of ideal in a conversation. It's an 80-20 conversation. You talk 80% of the time, and 20% of the time I'm talking. Most of the time I'm asking questions to prompt you to talk. Why am I doing that? Because I want you to formulate this sort of mental rough draft of what you're thinking. People don't know what they're thinking until they write it or speak it, in some way begin to communicate it. Because when they do, they often have what we call these aha moments. We see it in coaching all the time. Myself and my colleagues who coach for a living, executive coaches, see it a lot when people say, oh, now I understand it. It's like they just said it and they discovered it as they said it. I call it the rough draft of coaching. And leader coaches have 4 basic characteristics. These aren't the only ones, but these are big ones. They're always present. They're in that moment, and they're present in the moment, eye to eye, toe to toe, not exactly, but really eye to eye with the person, and listening very intensely to them. They ask questions and don't give advice. Some of the research on this is when you give advice, you actually put the other person down. When I'm giving you advice, I'm saying to you that I know way more than you, so shut up and listen, basically. It's kind of insulting in a way. Unless it's asked for or unless you have permission to offer the advice. And I'll talk about how you do that in just a bit. But when you seek advice, when you ask questions, you say, hey, can you tell me what's going on? You elevate the other person. You make them feel really good about themselves. And that's what coaching does. You're elevating the other person. You're helping them form a rough draft of what their issue is. The third thing is you want to listen more and talk less. We talked about this 80-20 rule. 80% of the time you should be listening if you're coaching, and 20% of the time you should be talking. And finally, this is kind of straight out of Ted Lasso's toolkit, or actually a poet's toolkit, Walt Whitman. It's be curious, not judgmental. Stay curious, and don't try to judge people, no matter what they say. Don't try not to overreact to it. Just say, okay, I understand that you don't like Joe. Tell me why you dislike him so much. Don't react or overreact to what people are saying. The big questions when you're coaching are why, how, what, who, when, and where, and yes or no. Now, there's a hierarchy, and the hierarchy is the worst questions you can ask are yes or no questions. Why is that? Because when I ask you, do you like asparagus, and you say no, then I only know one thing, that you don't like asparagus. But if I ask you, what vegetables do you like, and you list squash and potatoes, etc., then I get to learn a whole lot more about you. Yes/no questions are called dichotomous questions, and they generally don't work well. You have to sort of think like a reporter. You got to pretend that you're curious, that you're trying to gather data. Yes/no questions are the lowest end of this hierarchy of questions. Second, the next level up is who, what, when, how, and what. Those are all really good questions. They force people to answer you and to spend some time thinking about it. So if I say, well, what's bothering you, or who's involved in this problem, or how could we maybe fix it? It opens up the game to you. And why questions really are the top of the pyramid, but you got to be careful about how you use why, because when you use why, like, hey, why'd you do that, and why'd you do this? If you use it repeatedly, it feels like an interrogation. So sometimes I'll use why. Sometimes I'll say, could you tell me what you were thinking, rather than just sort of presume what people were thinking. Okay, so asking questions, stay away from music, and also stay away from if you can, leading questions. Like a lot of times people think they're asking questions when they say, well, have you ever thought of this? That's your attempt to push them into a solution. And usually when you ask that question, you shouldn't ask it, number one. Number two, you're moving them towards solution before you even understand what the problem is, which we're going to talk about in just a bit. So we're going to talk about coaching individuals, coaching teams, and maybe have you do some practice on your own, since this is a recording. So let's talk about coaching individuals. The 4 Ps is the model that I developed in my book, Leading Well. It's define the problem. It's a very simple model for having a conversation with anybody about anything, by the way. Number one, define the problem. What is the problem? Who's involved? How big is it? And so forth and so on. We'll talk about the questions in just a bit. The second is the present state. Where are we now? What's going on? How, on a scale from 1 to 10, how big is it right now for you? Thirdly, what's the possible future state? What would you like it to? What do you want? What would you like to have happen at this point in your life? And fourthly, what's the plan? What do you hope happens here? What do you hope happens here? What's the first step you might take toward that question? What do you want, kind of thing, or what's the first outcome you want to see? All right, so let's just take an example, and we'll start with the problem. I'll take an example. This young kid's name is Jack, and he works at a gas company here, a local gas company. He lives in Gaithersburg, Maryland, and he with his wife. He's 28 years old. He starts work at 8 o'clock in the morning, and but has to drop his new daughter off at a babysitting at a child care place. Anyway, that's the situation. He calls his friend Harry up, who kind of coaches him on the side. He's a more senior person at the gas company, and they sit down at lunch. And Harry says, "So what did you want to see me for?" And Jack says, who's in this training program, by the way, it's a 3-month rotation in different departments, and he's just come into this one department. And he says, "My boss is a jerk." And Harry says to him, "What do you mean your boss is a jerk?" "Well, he says stuff about me." "What's he saying?" "Well, he's calling me names like, hey, you can't tell time without a sundial, you can't get to work on time, and so forth." And Harry says, "Well, what's that all about?" He says, "Well, sometimes I'm late. I'm a little late." And Harry says to Jack, "Well, how late are you?" "Sometimes it's 15 minutes, sometimes it's 45 minutes." "Wow. How often does that happen?" says Harry. And Jack says, "Well, it happens a few days a week sometimes these days, because traffic's gotten worse on 270 and 395, or on the Beltway." So Harry says, "So why are you so late? Why don't you just leave earlier? Is there a reason you don't leave earlier?" That kind of thing. And Jack says, "Well, I've got a baby, and a new baby, 6-month-old, and we got her in daycare. My wife is off maternity leave now, so we had her in daycare, and we have to drop her off in some day, and it's the only place I could find that was open in Gaithersburg, and to get her to work, it's pretty hard. Get to work from there. It can vary, if you've ever been on the Beltway and you've ever been on 270, you know how problematic that is." So Harry says, so it sounds like you have a daycare or a child care problem, not necessarily a bad boss. And is that true? So he's sort of bottom lining him here. He's kind of paraphrasing. If you'll see here on the slide, he's paraphrasing the problem for agreement. And Jack says, "Well, I guess you're right." So now they have the basis of the problem. You can't solve a problem you haven't defined. And when he first came in, let's just back out of this for a second. When Jack first came at this and told Harry, he said, "Hey, this guy's a jerk." Well, his boss isn't a jerk necessarily. And so what Harry had to do is keep asking questions to kind of peel back the onion. That's what we call it. Oftentimes when people come to you with a problem, they're presenting really the issue or the problem, the symptoms of it, but not the real problem. You have to sort of dig. So be patient. Spend a lot of time in this section to figure out what the problem is, because a great solution to the wrong problem is still a bad solution. All right. So anyway, Harry bottom lines it and says, "Sounds like daycare is an issue," and Jack has just agreed with it, which means that you can now go on. So the second part of this is the present state. So Harry wants to find out how big a deal this is and where Jack is with it. So he says to him, "What's the impact this is having on you or other people around you?" He said, "Well, my wife and I are fighting. My boss and I aren't getting along. Even the crews and I are kind of going back and forth because I make them be late, waiting on me to go out." And Harry says, "Well, on a scale from 1 to 10, 1 is low, 10 is high. Where is this for you?" And Jack says, "Probably about an 8 or 9 now, and it's getting worse." So Harry acknowledges that, and he says, "Wow, okay. So we've got to really work on this and right now." And Jack agrees to that. And Harry says to him, "Are there any consequences of doing nothing?" And Jack says, "Yeah, I think I might. If I don't lose my job, I'll be reprimanded." Well, that's a pretty serious issue for him. So in this state, let's step out for just a sec. In this state, you're trying to find out how big the problem is. When somebody tells you it's a 7, 8, mostly an 8 or 9, then you want to pay attention to immediacy, because they are really in the hurt locker at that point. So that's the first of the first two of the 4 P's. What's the problem? What's the present state? Now let's look forward to what's possible. This is where you open up the parameter for the person to start thinking about what is possible, helping them understand what the vision for success might be. Sometimes it's just asking them a question. What do you want? I found that that's one of the best questions to ever ask, is when you get to this stage, is to say, well, what do you want? Well, I want to get to work on time, says Jack, when Harry asks him that question. So Harry says, how might you accomplish that? What are some of the options you might have? Now, at this point, Jack's a little stuck. He's a little stuck. He's tried a bunch of things. He's got his mind stuck. So Harry says, "Could we brainstorm back and forth?" So you can do that as a coach. You can brainstorm as long as you do it and then get back into coaching. Don't stay in brainstorming as an excuse to give advice. But sometimes people get stuck. And in this case, Jack gets a little stuck. So Harry says, "Would it help to brainstorm?" And Jack says, "Yeah." And Harry says, "Oh, well, maybe there's a way you can find somebody else along the way. You can get off the highway and drop her off somewhere else." And Jack says, "Yeah, I guess that's a possibility," and isn't really into it. And Harry says, "Is there anything else you got to go?" Given that, Jack says, "Well, maybe I could call around some more and see if anything's open up and get on a couple of wait lists." Harry says, "That's a good idea." And they go back and forth. Finally, Harry asks him, he says, "By the way, you work with other people, young people, a couple of whom live in the area and some live far away. What do they do?" And Jack just glibly says, "Oh, they just drop them off at a daycare center that's about a mile from the gas company." And Harry says, "Well, if I may ask, would that be possible for you?" He's just asking a very logical question. What would hurt? What would it hurt to just drop her off there if they have openings? And Jack just looks at him like, "What? That's in Virginia." And Harry says, "Who cares? What if you just came across earlier in They go back and forth, and finally Jack goes, "Oh my God, you're right. I have never thought of that until you asked me that question. It is just down the street, and there's nothing keeping me from asking them. It couldn't hurt, and it might actually work where I could just come across half an hour earlier than I normally do, drop her off, and even have time for a cup of coffee." So Harry says, "Wow, that sounds like a great idea." And they agree that that's a great idea. So then Harry holds him accountable, because coaching is about accountability. And he says, "Okay, there are 3 questions you want to ask when you get people in this state is, what are you going to do? When are you going to do it? And how will I know?" Because it's about accountability. When are you going to do it? What are you going to do? When are you going to do it? And how will I know? So Harry says, "Well, what will you do?" And Jack says, "Well, I think today or tomorrow I'm going to go down to this daycare center and see if I can't get on a waiting list, or maybe they have an opening right now." And he says, "Well, when are you going to do that? Today?" He says, "I'm going to do it today or tomorrow." And then finally he says to Jack, "How will I know?" Jack said, "I'll email you or I'll text you." That's all it is. Email or text, let me know. The pressure of having somebody else on the other end of this is really important for you. So now what I want you to do is find somebody you can pair up with. We've got the questions. We'll give you a set of the questions. These are the questions, but we'll give you a sheet. We'll attach it to the slides, and you can actually go out and use that sheet and the 4 Ps as a template, and go try to coach somebody. See if they'll be willing to do it, even if it's just as simple as going to lunch with somebody and saying, "Hey, what's going on?" and asking more and more questions. It's the questions, not the answers, that make great coaching. Okay? So now let me just run over one of the things that we see in coaching all the time. Whenever we do this in the classroom, we ask people to go out and make a list of, and when they come back in, we ask them to make a list of what made them, how did they feel when they were being coached, and we write it down on a piece of paper. And then we compare that piece of paper with a piece of paper that talks about great leaders that you've worked for, and they're almost identical. They're not exactly the same, but they're very identical in the positivity that they generate. And I always ask people, what does that say? And eventually we get to the answer that good coaching is the best leadership. In fact, Google did a study, Project Oxygen, where they looked at leaders, and they found that the best leaders, the number 1 trait of all, was that they were good coaches. This stuff is very, very powerful, and you get the same results when you have people do those 2 lists every time we've ever done this. So let's switch now to to coaching teams, or team decision making. The kind of what happens when you go from one-on-one to one-on or many-on-one, where you have a lot of people working to solve a particular problem. So there are some general requirements for this. You use the same 4 Ps, but this time it's a little different because we have some other people involved. Let me just show you a slide, though. It's an interesting slide. This is a slide that's set up developed by Hackman and Wegman in their study of teams. And this is what most meetings look like. Notice that most meetings are about presenting information, providing, and so forth and so on, and very little time is spent on collective work. So think about it. You've got this really smart group of people in a room, and you spend most of your room passing information back and forth that you could do in a memo, an email, or you could even send a text. If you notice the way it slants from left to right, from highest to lowest, the way it's supposed to slant, according to Hackman and Wegman, is the other way around, and where you're doing most of your collective work together. This is when you want to spend time making decisions and solving problems. But it's the opposite of what we normally have in most companies. Just wanted you to see that, because we waste an awful lot of time in meetings. And most people tell you meetings just are terrible, or they suck, or whatever. And the reason they do is because you're not solving problems. You're not engaging. You're sitting back waiting for your turn to speak. And if you've spoken, you go back to doing text or email. I mean, that's what people do in meetings. They get very bored. But keep them engaged, have collective work, and have a set of a facilitator or coach work with you, or somebody acting like that. And let me go over that with you right now. In team coaching or decision making comes from a thing called action learning. It's not here, but I'll just tell you about it. Action learning was developed in England by the Cambridge Physics Department. Now, most universities, if they have anybody that's a Nobel laureate, it's a big deal intellectually for the and reputationally for the university. In this case, it wasn't just a university; it was one department, a single department. The physics department had 29 Nobel laureates. I mean, that's like winning the Super Bowl for 29 years in a row. It's unheard of. And so they wanted to find out why were they so successful, and they started looking at their problem-solving processes, and they developed this. There was a guy named Reg Ravens who actually was a doctoral student there, and he started to document their process. And what he found was they had a very distinct process that was very humble. It wasn't a bunch of know-it-alls trying to show how smart they were, but there was a process that they used, and they developed that process into a thing called action learning, which has been exported to the United States and around the world now. And it has several components to it. Number one, you need a coach or a facilitator. You need what I call a traffic cop. You need somebody when you have 5 or 6 or 7 people in a meeting, and you don't want to have more than 8. When you have 5 or 6 people in a meeting, all trying to talk at the same time, and we'll talk about what we mean by talk, but what we mean is really ask questions. When you have a bunch of people wanting to talk, you need a traffic cop to kind of make sure that people take turns. And that's where the coach comes in. And I do a lot of this kind of coaching, but you can learn how to do this after you do this a few times and see it happening, see a demo. It's pretty simple. So you need a coach. Secondly, you need a coachee or a problem presenter. You need somebody to present a problem, even if they're presenting a problem for the entire team or organization. You need somebody to be kind of the sounding board that people ask questions of and go back and forth with. So you need a problem presenter. The problem presenter presents the problem in the first 2 or 3 minutes. You don't let them go on for like a half an hour talking about this thing. You don't need that level of detail. You just need to get them to express what they think the problem is, and then the group will start asking questions about that. There are 4 to 6 participants, which is ideal. More than that's hard to coordinate, and less than that's just not powerful enough. There's only a few rules. One is the coach controls the group and can stop and start at any time. The coachee, the person being coached, can only make a statement in response to a direct question, and everybody has to ask questions. You can't talk unless you ask a question. So you can only ask a question or be responding to a question. And what this does is it keeps extroverts from dominating the meeting. Otherwise, you have these extroverts just talking and talking and talking. And when I facilitate it, I tend to talk to the people about. A lot of times people, when we start talking about what's the problem, they'll start with the problem and they'll say, you know, what you ought to do is this, and I'll just stop and say, wait a minute, don't give advice at this point. Let's make sure we understand how this works, what the real issue is, and I'll kind of. Okay, so let me give an example of what this might look like. Let's say we have Mary, Jane, Ted, and Yolanda, and Jack brings the problem to the group, and Jack works in a government facility that helps people with their benefits. He works for a county, and his problem is talent. He comes to the group and he says, you know, I gotta, and I'll be facilitating it. He says, so I open the meeting up and I say, today we're going to talk about Jack's issue. He's going to present it for a few minutes, then we're going to ask him questions. And I invite him as a coach, to state the problem. Remember, we talked about the 4 Ps. And he says, you know, I work in this government office. We've got a lot of work to do, food stamps and a lot of support of people. But he said, we're only 50% straight. We've been losing people left and right. People don't want to come to work anymore. They want to telework in. This is probably sounding vaguely familiar to you. They don't want to come to work. We can't even get people to apply to the jobs. We have no idea what to do on this. But it's as we lose people, more people leave because they're being overworked in their stead. So I turn to the group and I say, does anybody have any questions? So the first person, I won't go through all the names, first person says, what have when did it start getting so bad? And he says, well, Jack says, well, it started happening about a year ago, or a year and a half ago, right at sort of where COVID was kind of waning. We had for 2 years we were doing everything by Zoom or Teams, and everybody was trying to do the best they could, but they were at home. We didn't get as many people walking in. A lot of our people, of course, they didn't even call in, they didn't Zoom in because they didn't know how to use it, and so forth and so on. And so the person says thanks, and then another person says, well, um, um, what are you doing about that, Jack? And I stop that person if I was a coach, and I'd say, hey, let's focus on what we think the problem is, rather than trying to solve it right away. A lot of times people want to go from the problem right to the solution. That's fairly common, especially among high achieving folks who are busy and they just want to get on to the next thing. But the questions go back and forth, and it seems like what's happened is they've had a lack of continuity of leadership. They haven't had any training, and there's been no effort. There's been what Jack has seen is that there's been no real um, um, effort to solve this problem. It's just that people have left, and as they've left, people just have worked harder and harder. Nobody's ever stopped and said, "Hey, what can we do?" So as a coach, I'll say, so the problem really is that you're losing people, but you've never stopped to actually develop any kind of a plan. Is that the case? And he says, yeah, that's kind of what it is. And this is after a number of questions. So then say, okay, let's talk about the present state. And then somebody asks on a scale from 1 to 10, how bad is this? He says it's about a 9, and it'll be a 10 pretty soon. So it's a pretty vital problem. And that if they keep going on this, and the questions about what would it be like if you stayed on this course without answering it, we'd really have some major problems. I think we'd have to shut the department down. We'd certainly have to curtail the hours. So they move to the third area, which is what's possible. And so Jack says, I don't know. I'm stuck. I don't know. And so as a coach, I'll say, would it be useful for us to start to brainstorm? And he'll say, yeah. And then oftentimes what I'll do, if we do that brainstorming thing, and again, it's with his permission, he's always in control here. I'm in control, but he's always the one that's going to determine what we do. I'll ask everybody to write down 2 or 3 ideas that they might have. And then we just go through each one of those ideas until we exhaust all those ideas. So after they've written them down, I'll say, okay, Yolanda, what was your, what do you have there? She said, I think you ought to have a meeting with your boss immediately and talk about planning to move forward. Okay, what's another one? And somebody else says, I think you ought to combine with organizations near you that work at the county near you to see if there's a way you could swap people back and forth during high stress periods. Third person says, I think you ought to do stay interviews. And he goes, well, what's a stay interview? And they explain a stay interview is when you start interviewing people that you really rely on heavily before they leave to find out what's it going to take to keep you here, and so on and so on and so on. He gets a lot of great ideas and actually opens up his aperture. He's not so depressed. He's thinking, well, I do have some options. And the last part of it is I ask him, what are you going to do? When are you going to do it by, and how will I know? How will the team know here? I usually represent the team in this part of it, but I'll just say, what are you going to do? When are you going to do it? And how will I know? And he says, well, I'm going to try stay interviews to start with because I think that's a brilliant idea, especially for the high achievers that we have before they leave. We're going to, so I'll say, okay, when are you going to do that? In the next week, he says, how will I know? He said, I'll call you up because I want to let you know how it feels and how it's going. And I'll say, okay, so that's what's going to happen. You're going to start stay interviews the next week or two. You're going to call me up, and I'll let everybody out of the team know what happened. Is that cool? Is that good? And he goes, yeah, that's great. That's how it works. If you go online and put action learning in Google and look at videos, there's a video by Steve Marquardt, who's at George Washington University. I think you'd like his stuff, and it shows you one of these things in action. So you might want to give it a shot. There we are. Let me sort of move to the next slide if I can. Okay, we're gonna kind of stuck here, so I don't know what's going on, but that's that. Okay, well, there you have it. Team coaching in general. The coach, what did you notice about the coach? What was the coach doing during this period of time? All right. What was the coachee doing, and how did it make you feel when the coachee responded? And how did you see the 4 Ps work? Well, you're obviously observing me as I'm going through this, but you want to think about these things when you get involved in a coaching situation. Remember, we started with coaching one-on-one, and we used the 4 Ps. Establish what the problem is, and the problem that people present is not always the problem that really is, number one. So you got to peel back the onion, ask a lot of questions: who, what, when, where, and how, and why questions, to find out what the bottom line problem is. And once you paraphrase it back to the person as the coach, and the person agrees to that, then you can proceed and then ask questions about the present state. How big a problem is this? How pressing is it? How many people are involved, and what's the impact on it it's having? Then thirdly, what's possible? Brainstorm the best possible future. What I always ask, what do you want? Or if there was a magic wand that was passed, what would happen? You know, what would it look like if it worked and something happened that you wanted to have happen? Get people to think outside of their brain that's pretty fogged at that moment. And finally, once they have a bunch of things, have them select only one thing, usually something simple and easy to do. What's one thing you can do, and when are you going to do it? What are you going to do? When are you going to do it? And how will I know is the planning stage. So problem, present state, possible, future state, and then the plan going forward. That's it. Whether you're dealing with individuals or whole teams. Remember, in whole teams, with whole teams, you need a coach. You need somebody to be a traffic cop. You use the same methodology. It's just many people coaching one person. And you can ask questions going back and forth. It's very effective. Action learning is a very effective methodology, and it's a riff on individual coaching. This is Steve Gladys with Steve Gladys Leadership Partners. I hope you enjoy this. I hope it helps. And let me know if you have any questions. Take good care.